Hello, everybody. Welcome to Ms. McGuire video lectures. And today we are covering anatomy of the nervous system. And I'm using OpenStack's Anatomy and Physiology textbook. So this PowerPoint will be divided into 3 video lectures. In the first part, we will cover anatomy of the central nervous system. Then second part, will be about anatomy of the peripheral nervous system, and the last part 3 will be a short video, a little bit about physiology. Right, so let's go ahead and begin. So the central nervous system composed of brain and spinal cord, and everything else, all other nervous tissue found through your body will be parts of the peripheral nervous system. So in this video, we will talk about brain and spinal cord only. So we're gonna start with the brain. And the first part of the brain is the cerebrum. Well, the first part that we're discussing, right? That's the most superficial part of the brain, cerebrum. And cerebrum has outer part that is called cerebral cortex. That's what we see as a wrinkled portion. And there is a fissure between the 2 hemispheres called longitudinal fissure. And that's a fissure that divides brain into right and left cerebral hemispheres. And there is a structure that holds those hemispheres together, and it's called corpus callosum. So longitudinal fissure is a division, and corpus callosum is a connection between 2 cerebral hemispheres. Now, underneath the cerebral cortex, we have basal nuclei. So basal nuclei are gray matter that, and the gray matter is mostly cell bodies and dendrites of neurons, right? So that collection of cell bodies and dendrites underneath the cerebral cortex is called basal nuclei. So we have several of them, and it's involved, it says here, in a cognitive processing, and especially in a planning of movement. So when your brain, your central nervous system plan your movement, right? The movement of your legs, your arms, so it's nice and smooth. That's a big part of that plan is the job of basal nuclei. Also, deep to cerebral cortex, you have a limbic cortex that is involved in emotion, memory, and behavior. So over here, you pretty much, you can see the basal nuclei over here, right? Some structures that is like hippocampus, amygdala, mammillary body, those are part of the limbic cortex. Limbic system, I'm sorry, not necessarily cortex, limbic system. Okay, so continue with cerebral cortex. Now, cerebral cortex has gyri and sulci. And gyri are ridges on the surface of the brain, or wrinkles. So, I mean, it's a ridge of wrinkles. So you have like wrinkles in your brain. That actually what it does, it's increase the surface area of the cerebral cortex. So instead of having head big like this, we have a, pretty, nice size head compared to the rest of our body. But at the same time, those wrinkles of the cerebral cortex allow you to have a large surface area. Now, ridges are called gyri. Gyrus is singular, gyri are plural, and grooves or depression when you go down between these gyri are called sulci. And again, sulci is plural, sulcus is singular. Now, cerebral cortex can be divided into, it might be, yeah, it's here, 5 lobes. We will look at these lobes in a minute. But if you see here the picture on the bottom, right, you have like a gyrus, so that would be a gyrus, and then this will be a sulcus. Now, what are those 5 lobes? We have frontal lobe, we have parietal lobe, we have occipital, temporal, and if you look over here, it's in between frontal and temporal. This lobe, like inside, this is called insula. So here's our 5 lobes, and because we have 2 hemispheres, right, we have 5 lobes in the left hemisphere, and we have 5 lobes in the right hemisphere. What are the functions of those lobes? Well, first, it's really, everything is interconnected. It doesn't mean if you say like, okay, this lobe is for visual perception, it doesn't mean that the rest of the brain are not involved in the processing of visual information. So brain is so complex, we're still trying to understand better how it works. But of course, each lobe has its, I would say, like a primary function, right? That's what we're discussing here. It's not the only function. It might be its main or primary function. But before we even talking about lobes, if you look at this diagram here that has multicolors over here, and like in the red color, we have primary motor cortex, and you can see it's right here, right? So here's the primary motor cortex. And then in the blue color, you have primary sensory cortex. If you see it primary sensory, we have primary sensory here, we have primary sensory cortex here and over here. And then we have this kind of brown color right in front of the primary motor cortex, and it's called motor association cortex. And then in a light blue, we have sensory association cortex. And then a lot of in this like light purple color is multimodal association cortex, right? So that makes sense to begin with. Now let's look at the occipital lobe. And if you look at the occipital lobe, you can see that we have primary visual cortex over here. So the major function gonna be visual perception. And then you have a lot of this blue area that is visual association area, right? That's our sensory association cortex, right? So because you receive visual information by this primary cortex, but to understand a shape, a color, the different information about this visual sensation, you need not only primary, but association area as well, right? So seeing something and understanding something, it's not exactly the same, right? So you see something, and then to, see the details and understand what this object really is, that's involved your visual association area and this multimodal association area, like your prefrontal cortex, for example, right? And your limbic system. So you see something, you remember you saw it before. So as I said, process is complicated. I don't want to make this video too long. So let's just kind of get into basics. Primary visual cortex, visual association cortex, and the major function is visual perception. If we look at temporal lobe, we will see auditory sensation, like auditory, primary auditory cortex over here, right? And then auditory association area. So the primary function, auditory sensation. Now let's look now at this parietal and frontal lobe. Now this sulcus, remember sulcus is a groove. This sulcus that separate frontal from parietal is called central sulcus. That makes sense, right? Central sulcus. Now this gyrus right in front of central sulcus is called precentral gyrus. This blue one is called post-central gyrus, because remember, gyrus is the heel. right, of this heel of the wrinkle. So that's the central sulcus, precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus. And precentral gyrus is the primary motor cortex, and postcentral gyrus is primary somatosensory cortex. And somatosensory means sensation that reaches your consciousness. And it's a general sensation like touch, vibration, pressure, temperature, pain from different parts of your body, specifically from your skin, from your muscle, from your joints, right? All this sensation, like somebody touching you, somebody pushing you, somebody biting you, right? This sensation will be received by primary somatosensory cortex. Visual information will be received by primary visual cortex. Auditory information will be received by primary auditory cortex, right? Now, primary motor cortex, this is where the neurons are that gonna innervate your skeletal muscles. So, you know, those motor commands that goes to your skeletal muscles will come from this primary cortex, right? So that will be the cell bodies of motor neurons. That makes sense? And that's why parietal lobe, the major function over here, it says somatosensation, and frontal lobe, the major function is motor function. But motor function, like movement, is really a very complicated process, and many areas are involved, including your basal nuclei, prefrontal cortex, and your cerebellum, right? So it's a complicated process that need input of many areas of your brain, but primary motor cortex, this is where this neuron, you know, begins. That pretty much gonna send information to your muscles, right? And very interesting is this prefrontal cortex, the one that has working memory, memory for learning, for solving complex problems. So that's the most anterior part of your frontal lobe. It's the most recent part of the brain that best developed in humans. And this is where your consciousness is what they believe, like who you are, I mean, your personality, not necessarily your consciousness, but your personality, who you are, what are your decisions, what is wrong, what is right. When you study for your test, that's important area that is involved in this task, this type of task, like learning, understanding, right? Another great area over here is called Broca's area. Interesting that Broca's area is found only in one hemisphere, usually in the left hemisphere. And Broca's area is responsible for your speech. So you can have a meaningful speech. You can talk to people thanks to this Broca's area. So it's a motor function, but it's motor function related to your speech, to you talking. And another area over here, shown with a dash line, it's Wernicke's area, that also found in my one hemisphere, usually left, and this one responsible for understanding of language. So somebody talking to you, or you read written language, so you can understand either spoken or written language. That's a job of this Wernicke's area. Kind of like pretty amazing part of our brain. Now, that was cerebral cortex. If we move deep, we have subcortical structure, subcortical nuclei, right? So for example, over here, you see a caudate nucleus, right? You see putamen, globus pallidus, right? That's a collection of cell bodies of the neurons that underneath this cortex, they're surrounding by white matter, and they're important in processing of information from the cortex, especially the motor information. So a lot of the subcortical nuclei, they're responsible for your movements, right? So kind of like you know, your cerebral cortex before you know, sends this information to your muscles and gives them this command to move. It will consult with this subcortical nuclei and making sure that you initiate movement smoothly, that you inhibit unwanted movement. So that this subcortical nuclei has lots to do with the motor function, right? A movement of your body. And also in this area, you produce a lot of neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. And what study shows that reduction of this acetylcholine production causes Alzheimer's disease. Also subcortical nuclei such as hippocampus or amygdala are responsible for your memory, involved in your emotions. And yes, this is the movement control that caudate, putamen, and globus pallidus. That's altogether called basal ganglia, right? So we pretty much have cerebrum, right? We have cerebral cortex, right? So that's gray matter. Then we have white matter. And then we have gray matter deep inside the cerebrum that's called subcortical nuclei, right? And that's what's shown on this diagram. Okay, so that was our cerebrum very briefly. And then we're moving to another part of your brain that is called diencephalon. So diencephalon would include the structures right here, right? So that would be our diencephalon. What it says here through brain, it means that all the information that reaches your cerebrum or information that goes from your cerebrum to your spinal cord and to periphery will go through diencephalon. Like all your sensory information will go through the thalamus, right? Like, I mean, even your vision, your taste, or your sensation of touch, sensation of temperature, all the sensory information will go through the thalamus except of olfaction. Olfaction will go straight to your cerebrum, so it does not pass through diencephalon. So thalamus is a relay center, and thalamus is discard. I just found it easy to do this, so all my drawings here is removed. So thalamus is this structure over here, and you have two of them. So we have two thalami, and it's like egg-shaped structure, and they are connected through this adhesion called intermediate mass or interthalamic adhesion. So that's the name. So we have like two egg-shaped structure connected to each other. That is a part of diencephalon. So all sensory information, with exception of smell, will go through the thalamus, and thalamus will direct this information to the appropriate part of the cerebral cortex. Then we have this area here that is hypothalamus, and hypo means below, and has a lot of function. Some of them are homeostasis, is a center for autonomic nervous system, endocrine system. It regulates pituitary gland. So hypothalamus, like this is your pituitary gland, and pituitary has anterior and posterior part, and posterior part of pituitary is actually nervous tissue. So it's continuous with hypothalamus. So hypothalamus connects your nervous and endocrine system in a level of this pituitary gland. And it has lots to do with your homeostasis, like it has temperature control, right? And regulates your endocrine system as well, right? So that's a hypothalamus. We do have like epithalamus, mammillary body is also part of the diencephalon. And epithalamus, I think, I don't know if you have over here or not. And another part of the diencephalon, I don't know, is it called? Yeah, so here's our pineal gland. It's part of epithalamus. Okay, so diencephalon. So this is our cerebrum, and this is our diencephalon, two parts of the brain so far, going from superior to inferior. And then we are in the midbrain. Now, midbrain shown here in green color. So that's all I'm sorry, that's a brain stem. So that's your brain stem, and midbrain is the part of the brain stem. So that's midbrain, then we have pons, and then we have medulla oblongata, right? So that's a midbrain, that's pons, and this is medulla, and all these three structures are part of a brain stem. And then we have our diencephalon, and we have a cerebrum. So here, right, and cerebellum. So here's the part of the brain. So cerebrum, diencephalon, brain stem, and cerebellum, right? So brain stem, we already just said, it has midbrain, pons, and medulla or medulla oblongata. So midbrain, it's coordination of sensory information. It has visual, auditory, somatosensory centers. Pons and medulla involved in the regulation of cardiovascular system and respiratory system. And we have many cranial nerves. Actually, out of 12 pairs of cranial nerves, 10 will originate or will be connected. Let's say they will be connected to the brain stem, right? Okay. So here's the midbrain shown here in the purple, and it has like anterior part, tegmentum, and posterior tectum. And the tectum has like this superior and inferior kind of like round structure, right? Right, and they called superior and inferior colliculi. Right, so we have two superior colliculi, we have two inferior colliculi. One is colliculus. So we have superior colliculus, we have two of them, inferior colliculus, two of them. The whole structure is called corpora quadragemina, and this is a part of tectum. And tegmentum is the anterior part. It continues with gray matter of brainstem. And it receives and sends information from cranial nerves. So that's our midbrain. We have a better picture over here. So if you see at cross section through a midbrain, right? So here's our tectum, right? So here we have a superior colliculus, like this, like a little hills. All right, inside we have central canal. I'm sorry, it's still cerebral aqueduct. It's not a central canal yet, but it's like a space where you would find cerebrospinal fluid. And then you have like lots of different parts, right? We call them nuclei, like, or some tracts. So information goes up and down. So that's fibers of tract or nuclei, like red nucleus, substantia nigra, like a really dark part of the midbrain. And this is the area where lots of dopamine is synthesized, and deficiency of dopamine production in the substantia nigra is responsible for Parkinson's disease. So we're not going into detail here because that's pretty complex, but you can see that midbrain has gray matter and white matter, and gray matter forms what we call nuclei. Here's another, like the whole collection of different nuclei. So that will be lots of nuclei that form structure called reticular formation. It will continue down in the pons and in the medulla. We will talk about it in a second, right? Then we have like red nucleus. Okay, I don't wanna draw. Red nuclei over here, substantia nigra, and fibers. That means here fibers, the information goes kind of like up or down. Or here, I think it goes down, right? So here information goes down because it's pyramidal tract and it's descending tract. So some axons that carry information from the brain to the periphery. Now, if you look at the pons, right, so it will be inferior to the midbrain. So it's a superior surface of the brain stem. It's also will have white matter and gray matter. And it has a connection to the cerebellum. It has the main connection to the cerebellum. However, both midbrain and medulla connected to cerebellum as well. But now what else we can see over here? So here you see fourth ventricle. We didn't talk about ventricles yet, but you will see white matter, gray matter. Here's our reticular formation again, right? Now reticular formation is important structure in your brainstem that's responsible for arousal and consciousness and wake and sleep cycles. So lots of patients with coma, they actually have damage within this reticular formation. So because it's responsible for your arousal, right? So, or some patient might have damage here and they cannot sleep, have insomnia, or they in coma. So actually the brainstem like carries such fundamental functions that damage to brainstem can be very devastating. Right, and we can see like trigeminal nerve it has its nucleus within the pons, right? So connection of trigeminal nerve number 5 to the pons. Now moving to medulla. Medulla has respiratory center, cardiovascular center, autonomic reflex center. In the cardiovascular center, we have vasomotor center, right? So that would send signals to your blood vessels to constrict or dilate. It will send signal to your heart to increase or decrease heart rate. All right, and the respiratory center as well. So you can see again what we have. We have our gray matter, we have white matter. We continue seeing this reticular formation, that is your sleep and a wakefulness center, right? So just kind of like to make very short summary, if we're talking about brain stem, right, that is shown here in green, midbrain, pons, and medulla. If you look at cross section, you will see association of cell bodies that make nuclei. You will see white fibers that are tracts, and we will have both ascending tracts, that go up, information goes down. Obviously, it should go through the brain stem. And then we have autonomic reflex centers over there, cardiovascular, respiratory, your sleep and arousal center, right? So very, very ancient part of the brain that carry the basic survival function, like your breathing, your heart rate, your swallowing stuff, right? Okay, so if you cannot swallow, if there is a damage over here, you might have problem, getting your food down, or problem breathing, or your heart, goes into arrhythmia, or I mean, you cannot control your heart rate. You cannot control your breathing, right? So very, very important functions when it comes to their really survival. So you will not find their consciousness in your brain stem. You will not find your personality or even memory, right? That's all part of the more modern part of the brain, like your cerebrum, right? But, you know, can you live without memories? You know, it's not a very good life, but you can. But can you live if you cannot breathe? That's definitely not. So brainstem is critical for all the functions that related to survival, you as a, you know, living organism. Now we're moving to cerebellum, right? So that's the last part of the brain that we're discussing. So we already covered cerebrum right here. Then we had our diencephalon. Then we have midbrain pons, medulla, brainstem, and now we are in cerebellum. So 11% of brain mass, it's a dorsal to pons and medulla. So you can see here nicely, here's our pons, right? That's a medulla, and that's a midbrain over here. So subconsciously provides precise timing and appropriate patterns of skeletal muscle contraction. Now the cerebellum also has two hemispheres, and they connected by structure called vermis. We cannot see vermis over here, but right. So like imagine if this is one hemisphere, it will be a structure in between, and then vermis, and then another hemisphere. And each hemisphere has three lobes. We have anterior lobe over here, like purple. Then we have posterior lobe, and we have flocconudal lobe right there. Now, instead of gyri and sulci, we have folia, and those are gyri. So this parts of the cortex that goes up called folia, and the white matter of the cerebellum has a beautiful name. It's called arbor vitae, and it means tree of life. Okay, and remember, we only cover really anatomy, not that much physiology. Now, spinal cord. Why are we talking about spinal cord? Because we are talking about CNS, central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. So location, it starts or begins at the foramen magnum, and it ends at a conus medullaris, like right there, that's a conus medullaris, and it's about at L1 vertebra level. You remember we have 5 lumbar vertebra, and then we have sacrum and coccyx. So actually your spinal cord ends right here. So it's way shorter than your vertebral column. So what is a function? Functions provide two-way communication to and from the brain and contain spinal reflex centers. And we have, you know, several structures over here. So let's look at them. First, we have what we call enlargements. So we have cervical enlargement, right? So would be kind of like this part. Then we have lumbar enlargement. And this is in the cervical enlargement, we have lots of nerves emerge that innervate your upper limbs. And in lumbar enlargement, we will have lots of nerves originate from that area that innervate your lower limbs. That's why we kind of have, you know, a lot of tissue, right? Nervous tissue in that area. Then we have nerves that coming they come to the periphery, but they attach to the spinal cord. So those are called spinal nerves. And we have cervical region where we have cervical nerves, thoracic region, thoracic nerves. Then we have lumbar nerves and sacral nerves. And those lumbar and sacral nerves, so because here's the end of the spinal cord, all right, so all these nerves that originate here, they actually go down first and then exit through intervertebral foramen. So they exit this vertebral cavity. And because they go down first before leaving this vertebral cavity, this area on the bottom has a lots of nerves, right? And it's called coda equina. It means tail of a horse tail. It's a bundle of nerves in most inferior part of your, let's say, like vertebral cavity, right? And then you have this shown here in green. This is a connective tissue, and it's called phylum terminale. And that's a connective tissue that attaches your spinal cord to the sacrum and coccyx. So it's keep it in place. Right. Also, if we look at cross-sectional spinal cord, so it's this one is actually histology slide, and this is just a picture. But you see, let's look here because this like a darker area, it's actually white matter. We just use a dye, and this dye, you know, it's color myelin more. So that's why the white matter looks darker. But actually on the periphery, we have white matter, and in the center, we have gray matter. So this is a gray matter, and this is white matter. And a gray matter looks like a butterfly, and we call it horns. So we have anterior horn over here. Over here, we have posterior horns, and we have lateral horns in some area of the brain. Like we don't have it in the cervical, but in thoracic we do. Now in the middle, we have now central canal. So that's a space where cerebrospinal fluid is. And we have also kind of separation over here, like in front, right there, it's called anterior median fissure, right there. And on the back, we have posterior medial sulcus, right? So that's a posterior medial sulcus over here, this one. Also, as the white matter is divided into columns. So we have over here anterior columns, then we have over here posterior columns and lateral columns. And I told you about horns already. Okay. So this is my model of the spinal cord that is, you know, pretty nice. And you can see that that's our, in the middle, a spinal cord that is located inside the vertebral cavity. And you can see white matter and gray matters that look like butterflies. So you see anterior gray horn, you see posterior gray horn, you see lateral gray horn, you see the medial fissure and posterior medial sulcus, central canal. Now this gray matter that connects this part and this part right together is called gray commissure. But what is in, we can see in this diagram, and we will get back to it when we talk about peripheral nervous system and nerves, but you can see covering of the spinal cord. Like, look, this one, this kind of blue stuff over here, number 9, this is the dura mater. So that's a dura mater. And then above it, this part here, it's epidural space. And it has a lot of, you know, fat and blood vessels like veins over here. So if you heard about epidural, it's when we have medication administered in this epidural space, and this is what, you know, just make you, so it's anesthetic, so you don't feel sensation, you don't have sensation coming to your brain, right? So that's epidural. Now this line over here, I think yeah, this next blue line right here, this is arachnoid matter. And you see you have like this huge space between here and here, and it's called subarachnoid space. I'm looking where's my name is for this subarachnoid space. I don't see it, but so this subarachnoid space, this is where you will find cerebrospinal fluid. And then this blue line, right, that cover the spinal cord itself, this is pia matter. So those are meninges or connective tissue coverings that protects our brain. And you can see them pretty well on this diagram, but we will discuss it just in a minute. So this is cross section of the spinal cord again, and we can see our horns, right? We see anterior horn or ventral, we see dorsal and lateral horn. But what is different on this diagram, it shows you what kind of neurons are found within those horns. So if you look at the posterior horn, so first of all, you see how we have this structure, this one, and this is called roots. So we have horns, right? So those are horns, and we have roots. So this is the ventral root, and this one is a dorsal root. So then these two roots, they come together and they form spinal nerve, right? So we have, spinal nerves, right, that connected to the spinal cord, and spinal nerves are connected to spinal cord through roots, ventral root and dorsal root. Now, what is inside those nerves? Our nerves are a bundle of axons. So you see these lines, yellow and red, green and blue, those are axons. And if you look at the ventral root, what abbreviated with yellow and red, those are motor neurons. So those are motor neurons, and they are axons. So the cell bodies of motor neurons, so here's our cell bodies of motor neurons, both somatic and autonomic, all right? They are found in the, okay, so somatic are found in the anterior horn and autonomic are found in the lateral horn. Now, why? Now I did everything the same color. That is not good, right? So let's do it again. So you see this is anterior horn, and we have kind of like red dots, right? So those are somatic motor neurons. And this is a lateral horn, and we have like yellow dots, and those are visceral motor neurons. And that means, well, somatic motor neurons gonna innervate your skeletal muscles, and you can move those muscles. Visceral motor neurons gonna innervate your smooth muscles or cardiac muscles. So those are part of your internal organs that you cannot control, but they need to be innervated anyway, right? So this is where they found the somatic motor and visceral motor are found in a somatic in a anterior and visceral into the lateral gray horn, and their axons are found in the ventral root. Now, if you see here green and blue dots, so they represent, they represent now sensory, kind of like sensory information. So the sensory information coming from the periphery, right, through your spinal nerve, towards your spinal cord, through the dorsal root. You see how this dorsal root has this blue and green fibers. Those are axon, and blue is it's a what are they? Yeah, over here, somatic sensory. So that means this will reach your consciousness and you will understand the sensation. So that's somatic sensory neuron. And visceral sensory neuron comes from your viscera, from internal organs. So that sensory information comes to the spinal cord through the dorsal root, right? And motor information leaves your spinal cord through the ventral root, right? So like your sensory information from you know, let's say from your hand or from your fingers or from your toes, goes through the spinal nerves, right, to the what it's called, this dorsal root ganglia, right? So here's the dorsal root ganglia where you have actually cell bodies, and then through the dorsal root to your spinal cord, and then your brain, right? Then your brain makes sense of all this information and send commands to your muscles to contract. And those neurons that innervate your muscles, they will originate into your ventral horn or your lateral gray horn, and axon will go through the ventral root to the spinal nerve and to your muscles, right? So if you think about it this way, spinal nerve is two-way street. We have both sensory information goes towards your CNS and motor information goes away from CNS, but roots one-way system. So ventral root only for motor and dorsal root only for sensory signals, right? That's what it is. Now, but that we look at what? We look at these horns. By the way, this horn goes all the way over there. So we look at these horns and we look at these roots, and this is called dorsal root ganglion. So here's our roots, and this is our spinal nerve. But now if you look at white matter inside the spinal cord, white matter is divided into columns. So we have posterior columns, we have anterior columns, and we have lateral columns over here. Now, all these columns here are now represented by blue and red columns, represented by blue and red color. And they just did it to show you that we have these tracts, either ascending, and ascending means we will go towards the brain, or descending in red, and descending means you will go from the brain down the spinal cord and then to your nerves, right, and to periphery of your body. So ascending tracts go up, they carry sensory information. That makes sense. If your brain receives something, it's always sensory information. Descending tracts carry motor commands from brain. And we have here posterior, anterior, and lateral columns, right? Now, that's very, amazing information over here. We're gonna look at ascending pathway, right? So we will look at this first. And I like it because it's a picture. Picture always makes so much sense, right? To me, at least. Ascending pathway. Specifically, we're gonna talk about this one. It's called dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. I know that's a hard name, but look, it means we are right here in this area. We in this dorsal column. And this is a blue tract, right? So we go up, so it's ascending tract. So it's a dorsal column, and then they call it dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. Now, what sensory information are moving through this tract? And it's gonna be your touch, discriminative touch, and vibration, right? Discriminative touch and vibration. So when somebody touches you, like, look, somebody touches your foot, or you see this proprioception. So let's say you're holding some heavy stuff in your hands. You're holding stuff, right? Somebody touching you. So how exactly this sensory information reaches your brain? So you can see over here. So we start with the sensory neuron. So here our sensory neuron goes from the receptor in your skin, goes through the spinal nerve, through the dorsal root to the spinal cord, right? So we go from here to the spinal cord, and then we're moving up. Oh my goodness, that's so nice, right? So you're moving up, 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 and you end up in a medulla oblongata. Or, you know, somebody touches your hand, for example, even it's a stretch receptor, but let's say somebody touches you. Okay, so that information goes through the nerve, right, through the dorsal root to the spinal cord and up, 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 up again to medulla oblongata. Now, in the medulla oblongata, something happened. You see how it will cross. It's decussate. So actually, if somebody touching your left foot, this information will be received by right side of your brain, because on a medulla level, those fibers will cross to the opposite side of the brain and continue moving over here. So you see here, they continue moving to the thalamus, and from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex, right? So somebody touches you, information goes from the touch receptor to the spinal cord, and it start moving up, up, up. And those are axons are moving up, right? Axons, and they make this ascending tract. They reaching medulla oblongata, they decussate, they cross, and then they go to your thalamus and to cerebral cortex. Now, this first neuron is called first order neuron. Right now, it's synapses in the medulla. You see, that's a synapse right here. So the second neuron is called second order neuron. So this is our second order neuron. Second order neuron go to the thalamus. So here's your thalamus, and it's synapses. So here's the synapse with third order neuron. So we have first order neuron, second order neuron, and a third order neuron. 3 neurons in the row that brings this information from your touch receptor to your cerebral cortex so you can feel it, right? And this is called dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. And remember, information always decussate. Somebody touching the right part of your body, you receive this information to the left, by the left hemisphere. Somebody touches the left part of your body, and you receive this information by your right hemisphere. Another ascending tract is spinothalamic. This one is important because you feel pain and temperature. So if somebody now hitting you too much or cutting you or bringing this, matches to your skin, this temperature and pain, it's not going through this dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. It goes through spinothalamic pathway. Now, the point is the same. We have first order neuron, right, that go from the sensory receptor to the brain, to the spinal cord. Then it's immediately synapses with the second order neuron. So that's your first order neuron, second order neuron. And this is where it decussates. So it decussates at a level of the spinal cord instead of medulla oblongata. And then it go up. So it's go up. So here's your pons, right? Here's your midbrain. And it's again go to the thalamus and synapses with the third order neuron and go to your cerebral cortex. So if somebody bring matches to my skin and it's hot and it's painful, then I will have my spinothalamic tract that's gonna bring this information to my brain. And again, somebody hurting me on the left side, I will receive this information and process this information by right hemisphere and vice versa, right? So those are ascending pathway. Now descending pathway. Now, ascending for sensory, descending for motor, right? So now you're gonna send command from your brain to your muscles. And we will have 2 major pathways. We will have direct pathway, that will be pyramidal tract, and indirect pathway, extrapyramidal. So pyramidal regulates fast and skilled movements, and indirect extrapyramidal regulates everything else, like your posture, your coarse movement, your head, neck, eye movement, right? So let's look at this pathway and see what it means. Now, here's my pyramidal tract. So, so now I want to move my muscles. I already received my sensory information. So I have my motor neuron that the body is in the cerebral cortex. So you see the body is in the cerebral cortex. And axon goes all the way down. So axons goes down, right? Then they either, okay, so they, so they either go down and then they decassate on the level of the spinal cord, or they will decassate in the medulla oblongata. We will not try to memorize where exactly, but we know that sensory information decassates, right? And motor information will decassate as well. So if I want to move my right arm, this movement need to start with my left cerebral hemisphere. And I will have what I call upper motor neurons. So those are upper motor neurons. So we have number one, upper motor neuron. And then the this one that actually now originate into gray horn, in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord, or over here, right? This will be my lower motor neuron. So we'll have two neurons down, right? Upper motor neuron and low motor neuron. Some pathway will include interneurons as well, right? But we still, this is upper, this is low motor neuron. It's important because depends where you have lesion or damage. If you have damage of upper motor neuron, or you have a damage to low motor neuron, that will cause different effects on your muscles, right? So again, if I want to move my muscles, the thought comes from cerebral cortex. Then this motor neuron will move, axons of this motor neuron will move all the way down, right? Decassate either on the level of medulla or on the level of spinal cord and synapse with a low motor neuron. And low motor neuron innervates skeletal muscles, right? That makes sense? And I consciously move them. Now, if we're talking about extrapyramidal tract, then the command can originate, let's say, in the midbrain. Right? So you consciously, you don't use your consciousness to regulate like your posture all the time, like you don't do it on like every second of your life. So lots of skeletal muscles, you still can move them, right? But on a daily basis, like when you perform your daily routines, you don't consciously think, oh, I need to contract this muscle to keep my posture, or otherwise I will fall down, right? So that's extrapyramidal tract does for you. The difference with extrapyramidal tract is that it does not it does not necessarily originate, right, in your cerebral cortex, right? So if it's not originating in your cerebral cortex, then it's autonomic. Okay. Next, this video is getting long, but I mean, how you can record short video about the whole brain? Now, blood supply to brain. So you see this arteries here, and what are the major arteries we can find? We can see this internal carotid artery, and we have vertebral arteries. And when they enter the cranial cavity, they form lots of connections called anastomosis. So they form lots of connection, and this way, if some of the blood vessels is damaged or plugged, hopefully, right? So there is a blockage somewhere, we have, extra blood vessels delivering oxygen to your brain. So vertebral arteries, they enter the cranial cavity through the foramen magnum, and then they form basilar artery right here, where you have your pons and brains and midbrain, and they form these anterior cerebral arteries. And then you have your carotid artery, like internal carotid artery, that enters through the carotid canal, and they form also a connection with the branches from vertebral arteries. And this circle is called circle of Willis, right? So just take a minute and learn the name of these arteries that are not that difficult. So we have vertebral, basilar, posterior cerebral, middle cerebral, and anterior cerebral. And over here we have internal carotid. And then we need to return blood back from the brain, right, to the heart, and it's done by venous circulation. And we have sinuses. So sinuses are veins, but they are just large and flat veins. And here you can see superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, transverse sinuses, cavernous sinus, sigmoid sinuses. So they all collect blood from the brain and drain it into internal jugular vein, and then to your superior, finally in your superior vena cava, right? So, but that's a venous return. We mentioned this protective covering meninges. It's a series of membrane, and we have dura mater or tough mother. It's a thick fibrous layer, covers entire brain and spinal cord, attaches to cranium and vertebral cavity, and supports and surrounds your venous sinuses, right? So over here, we would say that's our dura right here, right? So here's the dura mater, here and here. Then we have arachnoid matter, and arachnoid is this, I think, shown in a yellow color, and this is our subarachnoid space, this one where cerebrospinal fluid is circulating. So subarachnoid space, circulating of cerebrospinal fluid, and then this villi or arachnoid granulations or arachnoid granulation villi kind of return cerebrospinal fluid back to the venous blood. Pia matter means tender mother, and it's continuous layer of cells that cover your brain tissue. So here it's adherence to your brain tissue. So that's a thin covering of your entire brain and spinal cord, and it's extends into convolutions. So that means it goes, within your sulci, cover all your gyri and sulci. So the whole area of brain and spinal cord. Also within your brain, you have ventricular system. So you have spaces where cerebrospinal fluid is formed, and it's circulating through these spaces. And then it continues with the central canal in the spinal cord and with subarachnoid space covering your brain and your spinal cord, right? So we have 4 ventricles. We have 2 lateral ventricles, and this is the lateral ventricle right there, right? So we have 1, and then we have 2. Then we have 3rd ventricle, and then we have 4th ventricle. So 4 ventricles, 2 lateral, 3rd right here in the middle, and 4th ventricle. And so you can see here that's lateral ventricle right here. That's the 3rd ventricle. And here's the 4th ventricle. And of course, they are interconnected. Now, this connection between 3rd and the 4th ventricle is called cerebral aqueduct. Between lateral ventricles and 3rd ventricle, we have interventricular foramen, so also connection. So they all connected with each other, right? And you can see we have opening like aperture, median aperture, lateral aperture, and cerebrospinal fluid is formed inside the ventricle, right? So it's formed in a lateral ventricles, third ventricle, fourth ventricle, and then through this aperture, it exits the ventricles and it covers the cerebellum, cerebrum, a spinal cord. Some of it goes inside the central canal. So you see how it covers your entire brain and entire spinal cord. And it's also inside your spinal cord, inside this central canal, and it's circulating. So you're constantly producing it right over here inside the ventricles. If you're constantly producing it, you need to get rid of it. And where it goes, it finally goes through this arachnoid granulation to your venous sinuses. So it's back to the blood. So you make cerebrospinal fluid from the blood, right? Then it's circulating surrounding your central nervous system, and it returns back to the venous blood, right? And it's continuous process. So pretty much it explains over here. We have a structure inside the ventricles that's called choroid plexuses. And it's a network of capillaries and some cells like ependymal cells. But pretty much like it's a blood vessels, right? It's a blood vessel. They are modified, they're not exactly the same, but those are blood capillaries. And this is where the CSF is produced, and it's secreted inside the ventricles. It's produced from components in blood. Its flow is tied to cardiovascular circulation, obviously. And then its flow from lateral ventricle, third ventricles, fourth ventricle, spinal cord. And finally, right, because we're constantly producing it, it's returning back to the dural sinuses. Sinuses, blood vessels in your blood that carry venous blood. About 500 milliliters filtered daily. So this is how much you produce every day. And it's collect metabolic waste, and it cushion your brain and protects your brain from infection. So, you have a nourishment from the cerebrospinal circulation as well, right? Through diffusion, you can have some stuff delivered to your blood, delivered to your brain, removed from your brain. And over here, we can see that here's our ventricles, lateral, third, fourth. Then we have cerebral aqueduct between third and the fourth. We have central canal, subarachnoid space. And we can see that inside the ventricles, you have choroid plexuses, and it tells you where they're located. Lateral ventricles located in the cerebrum, third ventricle located in the diencephalon, fourth ventricle between pons, upper medulla, and cerebellum, cerebral aqueduct that connect third and fourth ventricle in the midbrain, and central canal in the spinal cord, right? Nice summary. And homeostatic imbalances. Wow, we still need to cover so much. Okay, so have to do it, right? You don't need to watch everything in the same day, but homeostatic imbalances of the brain, traumatic brain injuries include concussion and contusion. So concussion is temporary alteration in function, and contusion is permanent damage, right? Then we have subdural or subarachnoid hemorrhage and cerebral edema. This is where you have either fluid or blood accumulating either in subdural space, under dura mater, or in subarachnoid space. And the blood will be accumulating, for example, if you have rupture of the blood vessels, because maybe of a high blood pressure or trauma. And that's very serious condition, especially this hemorrhage may force brain stems through the foramen magnum, results in immediate death, unfortunately. And cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, also associated with head injury. Then we have cerebrovascular accident, or what we call strokes, or CVA. Now, this has happened when blood circulation is blocked and brain tissue dies. So it can be blockage of arteries by blood clot. So if you see over here, for example, we can either have ischemic stroke. So here we have a blockage. Ischemic means no oxygen and the tissue dies, or we can have a hemorrhagic stroke when we have bleeding within the brain and brain tissue dies as well. So typically leads to sensory and speed deficits. And we have what we call TIAs. Those are temporary episodes of the cerebral ischemia. It's kind of like it's a smoke, we call it mini strokes. And that's when we just block the area of brain for a short period, block this area from getting oxygen for a short period of time, and then it's a reversible. And TPA is only approved treatment for a stroke. It's a tissue plasminogen activator, and it will dissolve the clot. We also have degenerative brain disorders like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington disease, and they have different causes like Alzheimer, progressive degenerative disease that we believe result from decrease of the production of acetylcholine, right? It results in dementia. Parkinson, we believe, results from decrease of dopamine releasing neurons. Huntington disease is a genetic inherited disease. It's a fatal, and it's a accumulation of protein, huntingtin, that leads to death of the neurons. Now, when we're talking about spinal cord trauma, we have paresthesia and paralysis. So paresthesia is sensory loss, and paralysis or paresthesia, and paralysis, loss of motor function. So also paralysis, right? The paralysis is loss of motor function. So we already mentioned that depends where we have this damage. So for example, if we damage of ventral root or ventral horn, that I'm gonna show you where it is. I know it's video long, but I mean, if you have no idea where the ventral, or you forgot where the ventral root or ventral horn is, okay, where's a good area to show it to you? Right there, right? So look, if you have a damage in a ventral root, oh, that's gonna be, this one doesn't even have it. Okay, ventral root, so you have damage somewhere over here, or ventral horn, right there. So if you have damage to those neurons in a ventral horn or ventral root, right, then you will have flaccid paralysis right there. So then you will have flaccid paralysis because your muscles are not activated at all. No impulses reaches your muscles, right? And it causes the muscle atrophy. Now, if you have damage in the upper motor neuron, and let me show you where it is, upper motor neuron. So for example, if you have, not this one, because that's descending right there. So if you have damage somewhere over here, right, or over here, so you have this upper motor neuron because that's your low motor neuron. So if you have damage in the upper motor neuron, then you have not flaccid paralysis, but you have spastic paralysis, right? So you see, it looks very different. So flaccid paralysis or spastic paralysis, and your muscles still can be activated here by reflexes, but there is no voluntary control of muscles. And the last slide, I hope it's the last one. Oh no, two more, almost there, is transection. So if you have damage to the spinal cord like this, right, transection, you're gonna lose both sensation and motor function, right? And depends where the spinal cord is damaged. You might have paraplegia or quadriplegia. So first, remember, paraplegia and quadriplegia is when you lose both sensory function and motor function. No sensation, no motor function. And paraplegia, para means only two extremities are affected, like over here, only legs, but arms are functional. And this need to be damage of the lower part of the spinal cord, T1, L1, right? But if it's above T1, right? So if it's above T1, right there, then you will have quadriplegia. That means you lose sensation and motor in your both upper and lower extremities. And this transection in the cervical region, because above T1, obviously what? Cervical region. So, and it's transection, it's complete cut. So you kind of, yeah, like you make a cut over here. So nothing moving up and down, right? That's our transection. And poliomyelitis is the infectious disease caused by a virus. And what it does is destruction of the ventral horn motor neurons and cause muscle atrophy. Because remember, if we are in the ventral horn, we don't have any activation. This is the, our flaccid paralysis over here. And that goes to muscle atrophy, and death may occur due to paralysis of respiratory muscles or cardiac arrest. Okay, and yeah, one more very interesting disorder is called Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And this is progressive destruction of ventral horn motor neurons and the fibers of the pyramidal tract. So we have both like ventral low motor neurons and upper motor neurons damage, and symptoms: loss of the ability to speak, swallow, and breathe. And you know, this famous guy over here, right, who recently died from Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS. Okay, so that's it. That was a video lecture part 1 on the anatomy of the nervous system. Thank you for watching, and I hope it was helpful.